Hi everyone, it's Patricia Warby, Alchemy Therapies here, and a warm welcome. You can see the weather is improving, luckily, in the UK, hence my usual 15 layers. I'm reduced to a moderate 2 today, so which is a good thing. And today I want to talk about identity, which has been coming up a lot, and the nature of belonging as well, because we often put the two together. We say that we belong because we have a certain identity. We're part of the working population, or we're part of the retired population, or we're male or female, or perhaps we might think we're something in between. Um, but I do believe that's a rare occurrence, actually. So is it that the identity is primary, or is it the construct and the nature of believing ourselves to be expressing ourselves authentically? And I believe it probably is more to do with the label that you put onto yourself to make sure that you feel like you belong. And I think belonging is one of the key drivers to why people latch onto certain identities. I know when I was growing up, and when I hit puberty, suddenly all the sort of ways I thought about myself were shattered, because supposedly I was supposed to become like other girls, and I didn't feel I wanted to be like other girls. I didn't want to be interested in the things they were interested in. I didn't particularly want to dress the way they did or like the things they did. I certainly felt other growing up. I didn't think of it that way, but I felt like an outsider, on the periphery, if you like, of mainstream society. And when I looked around me, the kinds of music people liked, the things they did, I was always a bit alternative. And so it wasn't till I suppose I hit about 17 or 18 that I started to think maybe I wanted to express myself differently. Maybe I wanted a different identity. And university gave me that opportunity. And I discovered my sexuality was not straight, for instance. But that wasn't an easy decision, and it certainly wasn't one that I was encouraged to make via my peers, which is what happens now when people come out as trans or whatever. Um, it was actually against most people's wishes for me. It was certainly a very difficult decision, a very challenging time, actually, because there was a lot of shame around that. And I think I felt that that was very distinct from my perhaps presentation, my body state, because I didn't feel male. I felt very much a woman. So for me, gender and sexuality were very separate. I never felt body dysmorphic, for instance. I'm so glad I didn't. I did have a lot of shame around my body, particularly as it changed. And I wanted the ease of what I had had before I hit puberty, where boys and girls weren't that different. What puberty seems to do is it magnifies the sexual differences, obviously, but also differences in the strength and musculature, and obviously voice and facial structure. And it makes girls, I think, feel perhaps lesser than in some ways, unless they're prepared to fit in with what other girls are doing. And so we're peer led at that age, particularly girls are. We will look towards what others are doing and saying, and we will try and mimic that. And that can become a very restricted identity, because there are so many ways of expressing femaleness. You can be a pretty feminine young woman, or you can be not so feminine, and maybe you're more of a tomboy, as we used to call them. And certainly I was more interested in being active and being outdoors than I was in all the things that my friends were interested in. So most of my friends were boys. So I guess if I was growing up now, I might wonder, am I transgender? No, I don't actually think I ever was. And I don't think the majority of girls, perhaps, who are coming into that awareness of themselves and might identify that way are actually. And we've seen a lot of people going through that and then coming out the other side, because it's such a difficult time to be making a decision for the rest of your life, and just to allow that these things are malleable, they move over your lifetime. And I would also make the point that identity is a negotiation, really. it's not just what you say you are, it's how other people perceive you as well. And that you can't change. You can't make others see you in a certain way unless you kind of act in a certain way and you prove to people over a certain length of time that they can trust that about you. And so identity for me isn't self-declared. It is something you construct over a lifetime through experience, through learning. It changes. If I look at the person I am now, I'm very different to the person I started as. I can remember I used to live in London, a big city. I was very much a city girl. I loved London. I can remember saying, if I ever end up in the suburbs, my life is over kind of thing. Guess where I live now? Well, I live in the suburbs. I don't even live in London anymore. It became too overwhelming. So things have changed for me over time. I still have much the same personality, but I'm not as needy of expressing my identity over and over. You see, because labels are only one part of who you are. They're not everything, and they don't solve any of your problems. So if I label myself, it might temporarily give me an explanation as for why I feel the way I do, but it doesn't solve the underlying issues. If particularly you're struggling with anxiety, you're struggling to feel like you belong, that you have meaning in your life, I think identity should be something that you work towards rather than just apply like a ready-made suit. And you have to kind of learn how to express that identity in a congruent way, and congruence is really important, and it's something that we can't possibly know when we're 15, 16. Although we believe we do, of course I did, thought I knew everything, but we don't know ourselves that well, and we may be terribly insecure, in fact. And that was something brought back to me actually by being in contact with someone who knew me when I was that age, and saying how super confident I was, and how he always looked up to me and thought I knew loads of stuff, and I was really bright, etc. And I was like, well, that was what I wanted to convey, but I was often terribly, terribly insecure about who I was, because I'd grown up in a situation where I was supposed to know the answers to things, so I was good at pretending I did. So I did apply myself. I was good at being academic, but that isn't everything about me, and it was a great sacrifice as well, because I lost my love of music at that point. I stopped playing music. I stopped drawing. I stopped doing art, which was part of who I was as a child. So identities are malleable. They are constructed. They are negotiated within the social structures you find yourself in. And luckily, I didn't have the sort of social media pressure that kids today have to kind of conform. And even though we had a kind of binary world, I guess, I never felt actually inhibited by that, because I knew that there were ways to construct an identity that didn't absolutely go to each end of the spectrum, could be somewhere in between. So you could be a masculine woman or a feminine man, and that was okay. It was accepted without having to label it. And I think that's the important thing. And in my last video, I was talking about the diagnosis, when you have a diagnosis of a certain illness. And in many ways, that's a label. It's a label that medicine gives you to construct an identity of what you're suffering from, so that ideally you can have a solution. It doesn't always lead to that, and it can actually be a very traumatic experience when you get a diagnosis of any kind, particularly when it's long-term, chronic, or something that you're not going to survive. So I do feel like belonging is a really it's the unmentioned thing in all of this dialogue that we hear in the culture wars. All of us seek to belong, and belonging is not something you can manufacture. You can't make yourself belong. It's a sort of unconditioned acceptance of who you are, and it should occur in families, but it doesn't always. Hence, therapists like myself are very busy. But it can occur in your friendship group. It can occur in maybe after school clubs, things that you love to do in your sport, for instance. You can find belonging there. Belonging is this unconditional acceptance of who you are without you having to prove it or perform. And I think the nature of performance is really interesting. Now, that came up this week working with somebody who was talking to me about how strong the will to perform had been in her, to be the happy one, the laugh a minute, the joker in her friendship group, because things at home were not that easy. And so to mask that, she would just make light of everything. And she realized, now that she's a lot older, how much effort and how much energy that took to keep that going, that performance, when really in reality, she's sad, her emotions are not happy. She is struggling. And when you reach adulthood and you start to wake up to that, and you maybe make different choices, there is the worry that if you drop that identity, will people love and accept you just the same? Will you lose the belonging? And I think there's a great deal of fear around dropping something that you've adopted at great cost. Now, you can see the parallels with what's happening now with young people, and how this kind of the gender identity debate has been going. That maybe you adopt an identity because it seems to fit, and then as you get older and you kind of know yourself better, you might feel, well, that doesn't fit so well now, and you'd like to change it, but you might be stuck down a road, particularly if you're taking hormones or you're having reconstructive surgeries, that you can't reverse, or there's too much shame around reversing, because that need to belong is so strong. It will hold you there even if it's against your best interests. So, it is a great missing dialogue, the nature of belonging, and it's one that I want to address more. I'm writing a book on it at the moment, which working title is Outsider, because that's how I felt growing up, on the periphery of things. And I know that there's a lot of young people growing up that way too, and maybe it'll be good for them to hear an older person who's come through that, because we need a range of voices here. Just young people going through it are going to be very upset, very passionate. We need the voice of reason as well. We need people who've come out the other side and found other ways of expressing themselves that don't require such huge shifts that are going to be lifelong and potentially quite damaging. The other point I wanted to make is about how illness, if you do find yourself getting a diagnosis of any kind, or suffering kind of some condition, kind of strips you of your identity. So let's take the example of my client who got ill, and she saw herself as this fun-loving workaholic person who did the job she loved, and suddenly her body is telling her, we can't do that anymore. And it takes away all your energy. That's the nature of chronic fatigue syndrome, is that your energy levels go right down, and as hard as you try, you can't push through it anymore, right? The harder you try, the more you crash. That's the nature of that condition. And you repress your emotions because that's what you've always done. That's why people get chronic fatigue syndrome. It's not a random thing. You get that because you're not expressing yourself. And the message to your cells is, we're under threat, and therefore we have to actually reduce your energy output. And that's called the cell danger response. And it's perhaps not so widely known in medicine, but it's very well known, I think, in the circles that I move in. So if you lose your identity because you can't perform like you did, whether it was in a relationship or at work, then you find yourself adrift because you've no idea who you are anymore. And that's certainly what happened to me. And it is a frightening prospect if you're doing that on your own and facing that on your own. And if any of you are listening right now in that situation, please, please understand that you will come through this. But it is a scary time, and it can be very anxiety producing when everything you've believed about yourself before suddenly becomes untenable. Because we often attach to what we do, to our identities, in ways that are not healthy. And therefore, when we lose them, whether through illness or puberty or maybe a relationship breakup, then we are adrift because we don't have a substantive base in our bodies to understand who we are. We don't have that connection with ourselves, the grounding, as I like to call it, that says I am here and I'm okay. And even though what's happening in my life right now is distressing, I'm going to be okay. And it took me years to find that because I didn't learn how to ground in my body. I was very dissociated from my body. So making meaning, I guess, is what illness can often force you to do, is to find out who you are at a deep level. And that's not just taking on a label. It's exploring yourself in very deep ways, in ways which might feel very uncomfortable at first. I found out that actually I was very highly sensitive to my environment and very highly emotional, although I didn't express it, so you would never know. And just being aware of that has meant I've had to reframe my life to fit me rather than the other way around. So I've dropped the performance to some extent. I probably still am performing, but you have to when you're in a professional role. But in my personal life, I've very much stripped that away and learned to ask for help and learned to say I don't know when I don't know things, and not be the person that I was pretending all the time, because it is totally exhausting. And so I would just say to you, if you are exploring these issues, please reach out to others, but go to people who maybe have been challenged like this themselves and come out the other side, because your friends and family are not likely to understand what you're going through. Great if they do, and some people have the benefit of family members who really get them, but many people don't. And sometimes it's wise to go externally and find people who have been challenged themselves, because there's no better learning in life than challenge and finding ways to kind of transform that into something powerful and positive. So that's my take on identity. Obviously, I've kind of touched on some themes. I haven't explored them. That's for the book, really. I might do another talk on perhaps more aspects of sexual identity, because I think that's another really important area. But for now, that's all. Take care of yourselves. Be good, be kind. See you soon. Bye-bye.